Thank you so much. So I would like to speak about the role of translators and publishers in what I called the revival of Gianni Rodari's work in Poland. And I will later explain a little bit his Polish editor history, because it is interesting and different to the history he had in other countries. Maybe we can move on to the next slide. So Gianni Rodari was the most popular and recognized author of children's literature in post-war Italy. At the beginning of his career, he was strictly tied to the Italian Communist Party, PCE, and its publishers, namely the magazine Il Pioniere, of which he was the main editor, and the publishing house Editori Reuniti. His early books from the first half of the 1950s, such as collections of poems, Il libro delle filastrocche, the book of children's poems, and Il treno delle filastrocche, the train of children's poems and novels, namely fantastic Il romanzo di Cipollino, The Adventures of Cipollino the Little Onion, and neo-realist Piccoli Vagabondi, Small Vagabonds, transmitted the ideals of communism, pacifism, anti-monarchism, and internationalism, and they were popular in all of the Soviet bloc countries. The story of Rodari in Poland started with poems. His short poems were first translated by a popular poet Janusz Minkiewicz for various children's magazines. Minkiewicz was friends with Samuel Marszak, Soviet poet, writer, and Rodari's translator, and his Rodari's translations are influenced by the Russian versions. In 1954, Cipollino was translated into Polish by Zofia Ernstowa as Opowieść o Cebulku. Ernstowa wasn't yet a known translator, but she would become one of the most renowned translators in the history of Polish-Italian literary relations. And Opowieść o Cebulku was a hit, though not as much as in the neighboring Soviet Union, because in ex-Soviet republics, Cipollino is still read and known today. His other books were also translated, commented, and fairly popular in Poland. He had also another literary hit, Gelsomino nel paese dei bugiardi, Gelsomino in the Country of Liars, which was translated by a known children's author, Hanna Orzogowska, as Gelsomino w kraju kłamczuchów in 1962. And in 1967, his last translation by Zofia Ernstowa was published. It was a collection of short stories from Favole al telefono, Telephone Tales, in Polish Bajki przez telefon, but it did not gain much popularity. Rodari kept on writing and publishing till his death in the 1980s, but his books stopped being published in Poland. In 2002, a small publishing house, Wydawnictwo Muchowar, proposed Rodari's version of Collodi's Pinocchio, Filastrocca di Pinocchio, so in English Pinocchio poem, translated into Polish by Mikolajewski as Pinocchio Rymowany. After this book, 10 more positions from Rodari works followed, most translated by Jarosław Mikolajewski and Ewa Nicewicz. And I will examine the role the translators have played in this revival, and also try to situate the reasons for Rodari's decline within the Polish literary field. Maybe we can move on to the next slide. I will use the concept of the literary field introduced by French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. The literary field is the structured social space within which literature is produced, distributed, and consumed. It is characterized by the relationships and power dynamics between various agents, such as writers, publishers, critics, and readers, and the positions they occupy in relation to one another. Within the Polish literary field, both in the past and in the present, we can observe that some translators, especially those who are also writers themselves, have more power. They can introduce new books, authors, and currents into the field, and their symbolic capital is a guarantee for the quality of those books or authors. Historic examples of such translators are respectively Tadeusz Bojżeleński for French literature and Stanisław Barańczak for literature from English-speaking countries. Bojżeleński introduced a range of 19th century French novels, but also classics such as La Chanson de Roland and Le Grand Testament by Villot to Polish literature. And thanks to Barańczak, Polish readers could get to know Emily Dickinson, E. Cummings, and Robert Frost, among many others. And Jarosław Mikolajewski is an example of such a translator in contemporary Poland. He recently published a new translation of Divina Commedia, but he also introduced basically all of the Italian poets we have in Poland to our literature. Let's maybe move to the next slide. Yes. And let's begin by telling the story of Rodari's decline in Poland. So why did such a popular author stop being published? One of the reasons might be the economic crisis that struck Poland in the 70s and 80s and was also present in the literary field. As Natalia Paprocka observes, fewer books for children were published, the volumes decreased, and the quality of editions was generally lower. Also, more authors were accepted in Poland compared to the 50s, and also the fantastic element was widely present in the translated books, so Rodari was not necessary anymore. The 90s are known in the Polish literary field as koniec centrali, the end of the central, as Przemysław Czapliński famously called it. The market was no longer dominated by large publishers owned by the state, and after the events of 1989, a great number of new publishing houses appeared, many of which collapsed very quickly. A huge number of books were published, and on the market of children's literature, there were a lot of new items, especially translated ones, but this was associated with a decline of the quality of translations and illustrations. As Paprocka notes, publishers in this year sought to accumulate economic capital rather than symbolic capital. Rodari, however, unexpectedly returned to favor in Poland in the 2000s. This had to do with significant changes in the children's book market compared to the 1990s. At the beginning of the 21st century, the prestige of children's literature increased significantly thanks to several events, such as 2003 International Children's Book Fair in Bologna, at which Poland was the guest of honor, or the creation of the quarterly magazine dedicated to literature for children and young people Rims in 2007. Not without significance was also the huge publishing success of the Harry Potter series, published since 2000 by the previously relatively small and unknown publishing house Media Rodzina. And thanks to this development, children's and young adult books began to have a wider presence both in traditional media and online, including on parents' blogs. And this created a demand for better quality items for the youngest, to which the so-called Lilliputian publishers responded. Small independent publishing companies, often owned by parents who wanted better quality books for their own children. We can move on to the next slide, maybe. The key person in the Rodari Renaissance or revival was Jarosław Mikolajewski, translator, writer, poet, and popularizer of Italian culture in Poland. As he stated in more than one interview, he proposed the translation of La Filastrocca di Pinocchio, you can see the cover here of this book, into Polish to one of the Lilliputian publishers, Wydawnictwo Muchomor, and this is how he described the process to a fellow Rodari translator, Ewa Nicewicz. At the time, I met Kasia Wojciechowska and Małgosia Skowrońska, that is Muchomor Publishing House, and offered ready-made translation. Then I followed the blow. However, the blow fell on me. I worked as a reporter for Gazeta Wyborcza, traveled to Italy, and often took my daughter with me. One time I flew to interview Oliviero Toscani. My daughter Marysia and I walked into a bookstore in Florence, picked up La Filastrocca di Pinocchio, and the translation itself started flowing down on me. I called the publishing house, told the why said house, and Małgosia and Kasia made it clear. It would pay to publish on Christmas, and to get it out on Christmas, you would have to translate it in 10 days. So I translated. Had a lot of fun doing it, and the book came out at the end of 2002. I can't say for sure if this story is entirely true. Nevertheless, we can see somehow a meeting of great passion for Rodari, but also economic conditions, because he had to translate it to get it published by Christmas. Later, Mikolajewski translated 3 more books by Rodari for Muchomor, and all of the books translated for Muchomor have his paratext, mostly the descriptions on the back covers. And Mikolajewski continued to talk about Rodari in the interviews, in the public meetings. Rodari is even one of the characters in his non-fiction book about Rom, Rzymska Komedia, Roman comedy. Mikolajewski's Rodari was appreciated in the subfield of children's literature. Historyjki Alicji, która zawsze wpadała w kłopoty, translation of Favorite Dialicze, a collection of short stories, was put on EB honor list. As Mikolajewski stated, he translated also a short story called in Italian Stella Gatto and some of Rodari's poems about kids, but he could not find a publisher. However, in 2014, finally this book, titled Kocia Gwiazda in Polish, was published by Wydawnictwo Literackie. This is important because Wydawnictwo Literackie is one of the Polish publishing houses that are powerful in the literary field, both for their symbolic and economic capital. On one hand, they publish classics and renowned Polish and foreign authors, among which Polish Nobel Prize winners, Miłosz Szymborska and Tokarczuk. On the other hand, they successfully published some of the best-selling authors of popular literature. Mikolajewski presented Kocia Gwiazda to Wydawnictwo Literackie when he was already their collaborator. By then, he had already published several volumes of poems with them and some translations of books by important Italian authors such as Oriana Fallaci and Umberto Eco, which is probably also the reason why he could propose Rodari's books to this publishing house. Another translator who played an important role in Rodari's revival in Poland was Ewa Nitrzewic. She cooperated with a publishing house from Krakow, Wydawnictwo Bona, and translated one short story and one collection of short stories by Rodari for them. The short story in question, Niewidzialny Tonino, Tonino l'Invisibile in Italian, The Invisible Tonino in English, was the first book she ever translated. She went on to be a researcher in Italian children's literature and devoted a big part of her research to Rodari and his translations. So we can say that she is another example of Rodari's advocate and promoter in Poland. We can move to the next slide, maybe. The Rodari's revival, despite efforts from the translators mentioned before and from the publishers, seems to have already finished. One of the factors could be the lack of support for children's literature's translation projects from Italian cultural institutions, about which Wydawnictwo Muchomor spoke, comparing this to the bigger support they received from French and Swedish cultural institutions. We can move on to the next slide, maybe. As you can see, despite the brief revival of Rodari in Poland, his works once again lost their popularity. The role of translators and small publishing houses was crucial in reintroducing the author, but without institutional support, it was impossible to sustain the momentum and keep on publishing and promoting his books. We can move on to the next slide, maybe. I have some references, and thank you very much.